In the autumn of 1943, on a humid, rain-soaked airfield at Rabaul, a new intelligence report quietly circulated among Japan's elite naval aviators. Word had arrived of a new American fighter, an unfamiliar, heavy aircraft with thick wings and a broad frame. The Americans called it the Hellcat. To the men who had flown and dominated the Pacific skies since the opening shots of the war, the memo seemed almost laughable. Lieutenant Commander Saburō Sakai, one of Japan's greatest living aces, studied the document with his single functioning eye. A year earlier, over Guadalcanal, he had survived what should have been a fatal encounter. An American gunner had torn through his cockpit, shattering his right eye and leaving him grievously wounded. With blood filling his vision and consciousness slipping away, Sakai guided his bullet-riddled Zero nearly 560 nautical miles home, blind in one eye. His survival had become legend, an act of raw will and instinct, a testament to both his skill and the nature of the machine he flew. Now grounded as an instructor, he scanned the Hellcat specifications and laughed, quietly at first, then with genuine amusement. He wasn't alone. Around him, pilots who had spent 2 years outmaneuvering American aircraft saw the new plane's weight and dismissed it as another example of what they believed to be American misunderstanding of air combat. The A6M0, light, impossibly agile, and elegant, was treated almost as a spiritual companion. It was an extension of their body, a disciplined blade in the hands of a warrior. The Hellcat, nearly twice as heavy, seemed like a brute by comparison. Their confidence was not arrogance born from nothing, it was shaped by experience. For 2 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had maintained clear superiority. Allied fighters had struggled against the Zero from the very first encounters. In the Philippines, they were cut down in staggering numbers. Over Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, the Zero's arrival shocked the defenders. Pilots who dared to outturn a Zero quickly learned the futility of such a choice. Its combination of range, climb rate, and maneuverability was unlike anything American or British pilots had seen. The Zero's mythic reputation stemmed from more than its engineering. The Japanese aviators who flew it were the products of one of the most demanding naval training programs in the world. In 1941, a typical Japanese naval pilot accumulated more than 700 hours of flight time, far beyond the training hours of their American counterparts. Many had sharpened their skills over China in years of combat operations. These were not merely pilots. They were practitioners of an aerial martial art, shaped by the ethos of Bushido. They saw air combat not as material competition, but as a test of will, discipline, and personal mastery. Saburō Sakai embodied that creed entirely, striving always to perfect his art and surpass his peers. It was natural, then, that he and his comrades looked at the Hellcat as a misguided machine built by a nation that relied too heavily on machinery and too little on the human spirit. To them, flying was a duel. The Americans, they believed, were still trying to turn it into an engineering exercise. Yet within that tent at Rabaul, as the rain tapped steadily against the canvas, none of them could have known the truth hiding behind the specifications sheet. They had misread the Hellcat entirely, not because they lacked intelligence or awareness, but because the world of air combat around them was changing faster than any of them realized. Their laughter was sincere, but it was also the final echo of an era that was about to end. To understand why, one must look closely at what made the Zero both exceptional and vulnerable. Its brilliance lay in its extreme lightness. The Zero's designers removed anything that added unnecessary weight: armor, protective plating, and even self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted. These choices gave it unmatched agility and range, but at great cost. A few well-placed 50 caliber rounds could ignite its fuel or tear apart its wings. Yet early in the war, Allied pilots often never got the chance to exploit those weaknesses. They were outclimbed, outturned, and often ambushed by veterans who knew exactly how to press their advantage. The American F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's mainstay at the start of the war, was a rugged machine built with the Grumman trademark toughness. Its pilots nicknamed the factory Grumman Ironworks because their planes absorbed punishment that would destroy a Zero instantly. But toughness alone was not enough. Against experienced Zero pilots, Wildcats struggled to seize initiative. They survived by ingenuity, inventing tactics like the thack weave, where two fighters covered each other by weaving together so that any Zero pursuing one would expose itself to the other. It was clever and often effective, but fundamentally defensive. Behind American lines, frustration grew. Pilots respected the Zero, but knew they needed a better answer, a machine purpose-built to counter Japan's fighter, not simply endure it. The search for that answer began in an unlikely place, not a theoretical study, but detailed conversations with men returning from combat. Grumman engineers sat with Wildcat pilots, listening intently to their experiences. They learned how the Zero behaved, how it turned, when it climbed, where it faltered. They gathered every scrap of useful information, even before fate delivered them an unprecedented advantage. That advantage arrived in the form of a damaged but intact Zero crash-landed in the Aleutians. In June 1942, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga's aircraft went down on Akutan Island. Koga died in the crash, but his plane, the Akutan Zero, was recovered almost entirely intact. American technicians meticulously repaired it and subjected it to exhaustive testing. For the first time, the United States possessed a fully functional Zero to study inside and out. The tests confirmed what pilots had suspected. The Zero excelled in low-speed maneuvering, but suffered under high-speed stress. Its controls stiffened dramatically in dives. It lacked armor. It was fragile, and its long-range capabilities came at the expense of the pilot's safety. The Japanese had built a superb duelist, but the Americans realized they did not need a better duelist. They needed a different kind of fighter altogether. Leroy Grumman and his engineers abandoned any attempt to imitate the Zero. Instead, they built something the Japanese did not expect. A fighter designed to dominate by controlling when fights began and when they ended. The heart of this philosophy was a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. From this engine grew everything: a robust airframe, self-sealing fuel tanks, thick armor around the cockpit, and 6 powerful Browning M250 caliber machine guns. These decisions added weight, thousands of pounds of it, but every pound served a strategic purpose. The Hellcat did not need to be nimble. It needed to survive, strike hard, and leave the fight before the enemy could respond. It was the very opposite of the Zero, a modern weapon, built for a modern war. By mid-1943, when the Hellcat first appeared in combat, Japanese pilots saw only its cumbersome shape. They did not understand its doctrine. That misunderstanding proved fatal. When the Hellcat entered battle, it refused the turning duels the Japanese were prepared for. Instead, American pilots embraced boom and zoom tactics, climbing high above their opponent, diving with overwhelming speed, firing a precise and devastating burst, and then climbing away before the Zero could react. The Zero could not match the Hellcat in a dive, it could not catch it in a climb. It could not absorb the firepower it now faced. Compounding the problem was a crisis Japan could not solve: pilot attrition. The extraordinary training that had produced masters like Sakai was too slow to replace the losses now occurring across the Pacific. Veteran squadrons were depleted. In their place came younger pilots, brave, willing, but rushed through abbreviated training programs. Meanwhile, America had turned pilot training into an industrial process. New aviators arrived in theater with 500 to 600 flight hours, many with more than 200 in the Hellcat alone. They were not just well-trained, they were trained specifically to fight the Zero. The turning point came on June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan committed nearly 450 aircraft in an attempt to cripple the American fleet. But American radar spotted them over 100 miles away. Hundreds of Hellcats scrambled into the sky, coordinated by experienced fighter directors aboard the carriers. The Japanese formations, many flown by inexperienced pilots, encountered a wall of disciplined American fighters. What followed was devastating. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. Only about 30 American planes were lost. The event became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Back on Iwo Jima, Saburō Sakai was no longer fighting in the front-line sky. His injuries had relegated him to training new pilots. He listened as shattered, shaken young aviators returned with accounts of a blue, heavy American fighter that would not turn, could not be shaken, and seemed almost impervious to damage. Sakai had once laughed when he first heard its name. Now, as he watched his students depart on missions that many would not survive, the laughter felt like a relic from a world that no longer existed. The Hellcat's dominance did not end in the Marianas. For the remainder of the war, it was the principal American fighter in the Pacific. Over 2 years of frontline service, it destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft. Its victory-to-loss ratio, often cited as 19-1, remains one of the most remarkable in aviation history. 305 American pilots became aces flying the Hellcat. Pilots like Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, became icons not only because of their skill, but because the Hellcat's durability allowed them to survive engagements, learn, and return stronger. The consequences for Japan were profound. The destruction of its veteran aviators created a void that could not be filled. As the war intensified, Japan turned to increasingly desperate measures. The rise of kamikaze attacks was a tragic acknowledgement of defeat, a strategy born from the reality that conventional aerial combat was no longer survivable against American fighters like the Hellcat. Years later, Saburō Sakai reflected on the conflict with an honesty that only survivors possess. He insisted the Zero was a purer, more beautiful expression of aerial combat, but he conceded a truth that defined the war's outcome. The Hellcat was a better weapon system. Some quotes attributed to Sakai, whether exact or paraphrased by those who knew him, capture the depth of that realization, that the Japanese pilots who survived the war did so only because a Hellcat pilot chose not to kill them. Whether he spoke those precise words is less important than the sentiment they represent. The Zero was a masterpiece of engineering philosophy, light, agile, and tailored for an earlier era of warfare. But the Hellcat symbolized a new age, one shaped by industrial power, systemic thinking, and the protection of the individual operator. The Japanese pilots had stepped into the future armed with the perfect sword. The Americans arrived with a machine that rendered the duel itself obsolete. In the contrast between the Zero and the Hellcat lies the story of two nations and two visions of war. Japan built fighters for the warrior. America built fighters for the system. And in the vast skies of the Pacific, system beat skill, not because skill had lost its value, but because the world around it had changed. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific and the echoes of dogfights faded, the legacy of the F-6F Hellcat became undeniable. It wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the embodiment of an entirely new philosophy of air warfare, one that prioritized strategy, systems, and the survival of the pilot over the fleeting glory of the duel. For Japan, the consequences were stark. The Zero, once feared and revered, had been outmatched not by better skill alone, but by a weapon designed with precision, resilience, and purpose. Saburō Sakai, the one-eyed ace who had once laughed at the reports of the clumsy Hellcat, lived to witness the final outcome. He had seen the transformation of the sky, the rise of industrialized air power, and the human cost of an empire that could no longer match it. His reflections remind us of a sobering truth about warfare. In the modern era, the most effective weapon is not always the sharpest sword. It is the system, the strategy, and the people it protects. If you've been captivated by this story of innovation, courage, and the clash of philosophies, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into military history. Every week, we explore iconic battles, legendary machines, and the men who piloted them, bringing history alive in vivid detail. And don't just stop here. Check out our end screen videos for more legendary matchups of World War II, from the Spitfire versus the Messerschmitt to carrier battles that shaped the Pacific. Each story reveals how technology, tactics, and human determination collided in the skies. Finally, we want to hear from you. Comment below on which historical battles or aircraft you'd like us to cover next. Your suggestions guide the next chapter in our journey through history's most pivotal air wars. Remember, history isn't just about dates and statistics. It's about understanding the decisions, the machines, and the men who shaped the world from above. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the skies of the next story.